Our presenter today is Carmen Orth-Alfie.
Yes.
She's currently the coordinator of Government Information Services and Engagement at the University of Kansas Libraries. Her Federal Depository Library experiences span a variety of positions from student employee to support staff and now regional coordinator. She has promoted the awareness and use of Congressional Committee Hearings through library instruction to students and researchers and conference presentations for library colleagues locally and nationally. Her enthusiasm for Congressional Committee Hearings was formed while watching the early years of C-SPAN and reading the record labeling hearing. So thank you very much, Carmen, for doing our webinar today, and the floor is yours.
Hi, everybody. I'm really excited to talk about hearings. It really is my favorite government genre and government information genre. And I chose this lights, camera, action because I want to help bring awareness to the fact that we do have the information from hearings available to us in multiple forms, including through video streams now. And I think that really opens up the use of the genre as well. So to get started, I've challenged different people to think about what a committee hearing is. So we're going to go through some other slides to think about what these images mean to us from other genres, and how we describe these to people and where we know to look for them. So this is sort of a self-assessment on what you might know or not know. So the first one is probably very obvious to all of us. These are from the New York Times. They're newspaper articles, and I believe we could all describe what a newspaper article is and why it might be relevant to someone's research. And again, here are some books. We can describe books. We know that there's title pages and publishers and authors and the type of information we might expect in a trade publication versus a scholarly monograph. And then the same is true for articles. We know how to find articles. These are from Wilson Omnifile, I believe. And these are articles that are talking about some of the same topics that hearings talk about. But we can describe these. We know that they have abstracts, introductions, list of resources or references, methodology if it was a research article, conclusion, all of that. So this is really where the real test comes in. What are we looking at here? We have two covers from hearing pages, which I imagine a lot of you are familiar with. The back one with the image of a person on it is from C-SPAN. I pulled that off the video archive a while back. And the one on the Committee on Energy, that's an actual committee page associated with a specific hearing. So what we're going to try to cover today is what is a hearing made out of? What does it consist of? And where would we find that information? So this is a basic definition from our American government, and it just is a meeting or a session held by a congressional committee. This particular definition implies that there's three kinds of hearings. I have another document that shows that there's four kinds of hearings, and they're not exclusive to each other. But before I get into that, I just want to let you know that some of the things I'm trying to get out in this are these learning outcomes. I want you to be able to describe and articulate what a hearing is and understand why it might be relevant to researchers and also places we might go searching for that content. This slide is my favorite infographic that I use to describe the legislative process. Keep in mind, not all hearings fall within the legislative process. There are investigative hearings that may not include any legislation. But one of the reasons why I like this particular graph is that we have in the yellow and the purple color, it says committee work. And in that committee work, that includes congressional committee hearings. So from a very short little report from the Congressional Research Service called Types of Committee Hearings, they define four types of hearings. There's the confirmation hearing, the oversight, the legislative, and the investigative. And as I said, they're not exclusive, meaning you can have an oversight hearing that also includes consideration of new legislation. And the same can be true for investigation. So the confirmation hearing, I should have pointed out that I'm going to include images of different hearings because I think that one of the challenges we have is visualizing what this kind of content looks like. So These are images of confirmation hearings. We have one from C-SPAN, one from the committee page, and one from the cover of the transcript. So a confirmation hearing is going to have that testimony. It might be for one person's confirmation, or it might be multiple confirmations. Depending on the type of research, these may not be as relevant for some people. It really just depends on what their topic of research might be. We have oversight hearings, and again, we have the titles from some of them. Some of these are kind of old, but basically, oversight hearings are going to be discussing something that's already law, and it will include it's often going to seek to improve the efficiency, economy, and effectiveness of government operations. This is the bulk of most committee hearings because a lot of laws already exist, so there's a lot of oversight committee hearings. So the legislative hearings are similar in that they're looking at a policy and considering whether or not something should be resolved using new legislation, new laws. I think that this particular kind of hearing is really helpful for students who are working on policy kinds of topics, current issues. They can use them to write speeches, persuasive papers. Then we have the investigative hearings. And when you think about investigative hearings, they're frequently associated with something catastrophic. So like there's the PB oil spills. There were several investigative hearings associated with the oil spills. And different committees looked at those oil spills from different perspectives. Here on this particular slide, we have the head injuries in football and the outbreaks of salmonella in egg production. I think these are some of the more interesting ones because they get a lot of people involved. So the scope of hearings, as you can tell by some of the slides we've already looked at, it can be about just about anything you can think of. These are some past ones that I've used for different slides before. I mentioned the oil spill, the Google book settlement, war in Afghanistan, the flu. But then there's some things that just reoccur because there might be a sunset provision in some legislation, especially in appropriation hearings. So one of the reasons why I really like congressional committee hearings is because they provide different worldviews. They provide different perspectives on the same specific topic or a specific question. But they're kind of difficult to find. When someone does a Google search, depending on what they've been searching, I think we've all probably heard of filter bubbles, which records information about our IP address and our computer use, what we've been searching, what we've been opening up, when we're on the computer, etc. And that all affects how our search engines go out and find information based on what we're searching for when we look for a committee hearing. So quite often, when you're using an internet search engine like Google, you might find individual parts, you might find one testimony, you might find a newspaper article about it, but chances are you're going to struggle to find the specific hearing transcript or the specific hearings page from the committee where you have all the content associated with it. Now, I did a search just today to make sure what the results are looking like for me. And so I looked for a cyber espionage House hearing. And because I have not cashed out my search results or my searches for quite some time, I have pretty effective search results. And you'll notice that the top one is from the Energy Commerce.House Committee. And the second one is the same hearing page from the Democrats.EnergyCommerce.gov. And I do have some newspaper articles, and I have a PDF of something coming from someplace. But I would challenge you to look for that same search and see if you even come up with the same top results. I'm going to guess that you probably do not. Now, something I think is important to know about hearings and committees is that not all committees treat hearings the same. Some committees will stream them, some committees will not. Some committees will have archives that you can watch anytime, and they've been doing this for several years now. But some committees also just do not look at the record of that hearing quite the same way. So that example of that cyber espionage, we have the controlling party, which has the regular domain for the Energy and Commerce Committee in the House. And then we have the minority party's version of that same hearing. If you look at it and you go to those 2 pages, you would see some subtle differences associated with that. I did not do a screen capture on this, but it's important to know that committees are required to point to the minority or majority pages of or websites, main websites. So if you were to go to either one of these particular hearing pages, either scrolling up or down, you should be able to find where it says majority or minority, depending on which page you're on. So now let's talk about the content of the hearings. All the hearings are going to have an opening statement by the chair and maybe even the ranking minority member. There's going to be written testimony that has to be submitted ahead of time. Some of the committees will have slightly different rules, but it's usually several days ahead. And I've actually watched a hearing on the Google Books several years ago where one of the testimonies was not submitted ahead of time, and the person was there to testify, and it was the Register of Copyrights. Someone on the committee actually wanted to strike the testimony because she did not submit her written testimony on time. The chair of the committee decided to waive the rule and allow that testimony to be submitted. Then there's going to be possibly other remarks from other committee members depending on how that committee chair handles the hearing. There's going to be oral remarks summarizing their testimony from each of the people that have been summoned to the hearing. And then you're going to have the questioning and examining of the witnesses. And depending, again, on the committee and their rules, the questioning might come just from the committee members, or the panel itself might be allowed to ask each other questions. And then there is frequently exhibits and articles and other reports that are submitted as part of the record of that hearing, but we don't often see that content in the transcript that GPO publishes. So here's an opening statement. So from this hearing on the securing America's interest in Iraq, we see that there's an opening statement from Joseph Biden. And one of the things I want to point out about the opening statements, they tend to be very short. They're often prepared ahead of time, and so the committee chair just reads them. And typically they clearly define sort of the thesis of this hearing, what it is we want to learn, what questions are we trying to address. Now the witnesses that are being asked to submit a testimony and are subpoenaed to go in front of the committee can vary from different types. We can have celebrities if they want to raise the profile of that particular hearing and get media's attention. There can be academic scholars, so their written testimony is going to look a lot like a journal article. There can be government officials. That could be from a nonpartisan group like CRS, Congressional Research Service, or Congressional Budget Office, or it might be from an agency that is affected by the particular legislation or oversight, or the particular catastrophic event that happened. So it might be someone like the Secretary of Agriculture or the Secretary of Defense, that type of person. And then you can have representatives from interest groups, organizations, companies. So in example of the Google Books hearing that I watched, there was definitely a representative from Google. But there was also a representative from a group that represented people who are blind. I can't remember the exact name of the group. And in watching these hearings, sometimes you can tell things about hearings that you might not be able to tell when you're reading a transcript. So in that hearing about Google Books, there was discussion about whether or not e-readers could be providing audio of content and doing that legally. And so the interest of those who are blind is that they need to be able to hear it in order to get the content. And in the audience, there were a lot of people who also happened to be blind. And I don't think in the transcript of the hearing I could tell that, but I could tell it by watching it from the committee page. And then lastly, we might have private citizens that are directly affected by either the event that happened or the proposed legislation. So just for the fun, here's some celebrities that have testified in the committee hearings. So Michael J. Fox has testified on Parkinson's disease. Frank Zappa testified in the record labeling hearing that was mentioned in my bio. Christopher Reeve testified on stem cell research, Colbert on immigrant farm workers, Mary Tyler Moore on diabetes, and Jewel was on homelessness. So academics, scholars definitely participate. I've had people kind of think that the scholars that are going to testify in hearings are either historians or economists, and that's not really true. I did a search in ProQuest Congressional a while back and looked for affiliation and discovered that probably about once a year on average, someone from the University of Kansas has testified in front of some committee, and it ranged anywhere from music therapy and the aging, rural medicine, ADA, and even fine arts. So you might be interested in seeing who from your own institution has testified at committee hearings. So as I mentioned before, the government officials can be those nonpartisan groups, military personnel as well. And I forgot to put a slide in about this, but the military personnel reminds me that, you know, it's not an everyday activity to testify in front of a committee hearing. And so there are manuals that are written and guides that are written to help those who have been subpoenaed to appear in a committee hearing. And the military has their own version of this. And it's complete with cartoons like a lot of other military kinds of publications and guides. And I don't think I mentioned it earlier, but senators and representatives sometimes will testify in front of other committees. So the representatives from interest groups and organizations, they help provide that specific interest and experience and knowledge and provide personal stories. So in the DREAM Act, when there was hearings about the DREAM Act, there was a lot of almost oral histories about someone's experience of being raised in the United States but not born in the United States, and the impact on their ability to get a education and to work. So you get a lot of personal stories depending on the topics. Earlier I mentioned there was written and oral and question and answering. Those three types of testimony are documented in different ways. So the written testimony is typically put onto the website for each of the committee hearings, and it's available ahead of time. And so you can look at those drafts, and sometimes that's what shows up when you do a search in Google or in Bing. The oral remarks, they're going to be sometimes exactly what's in the written, and sometimes it's just highlighting and summarizing what's in the written. And it could include other kind of information than there could be differences between the written testimony and the oral testimony. And where you're going to find those remarks are definitely in the transcript, but you're also going to see those remarks within the videos as well. And then the question and answering is not scripted, so we're not really sure what they're going to say until it happens. And that will be in the transcript, and it should be on the video as well, as long as it's available. Now the part that seems to be most elusive in the printed transcript is the exhibits. Now typically within the transcripts we'll have the copies of the proposed legislation, so it'll have the text of the bill. And there might be some reproductions of articles, statistics, graphs, and some comments that were recorded after the fact. Sometimes there's hearings that will present some questions to those on the panel and ask them to submit those later on, and that will become part of the transcript as well. But there's also some other primary documents that are sometimes shown and mentioned, but they're not part of the transcript. And the example I'd like to give here is the outbreak of salmonella in eggs. I've used this example so many times that I've distorted the Google search results associated with this particular hearing. And the location that you would find this on is going to be the Democrat website, which the Democrats were the ruling party or controlling party at the time of this hearing. And their content is quite complete, including photographs from the FDA showing the violations from the different locations on that farm where the outbreak was occurring. So in terms of finding these things, the hearings, there's different methods of distributing the content. And to note some of the free ones, we have the Congressional Committee web pages. C-SPAN video library, which they opened up their complete video library. So if a hearing broadcasted on C-SPAN, you should be able to find that video as well as a closed captioning transcript. So that would be an unofficial transcript, but it could at least be a transcript. Then GPO, if Congress and the committee order it to be printed, the official transcript is available in print. It might be available on FDSys, but not all hearings that are digitized and printed are available through FDSys. It's one of those frustrating things that I wish would change. But if the committee doesn't approve it to be on FDSys, it's not searchable there. And then, of course, there's subscription databases. Some of us have access to ProQuest Congressional. Some of us have access to the full text transcripts through ProQuest. Hide Online now includes a lot of digitized copies of the transcripts. And then HathiTrust has some, and because they're not copyrighted, they're going to be all over the place. So this is just an image from C-SPAN showing one of the committee hearings on the influenza, the H1N1. But you can search for people's testimony. You can sort, find things within a certain time period within there. And you can look for related programs, and that's one of the reasons why I pulled up this particular slide. So you can find additional content. I believe in understanding what something looks like visually, and I tell the students that I've worked with, I can see from across the room, I can tell the difference between a hearing versus other kinds of government publications. And so, the elements are always there. You're going to have the title. It's going to tell you what committee is holding that particular hearing, the date of it, the session, the serial number, and that it's published by the government printing office. Now, the committee web pages are going to vary a great deal. Each committee gets to decide for themselves how this is set up, and it frequently changes. And there was definitely a huge change when the House, which was controlled by the Democrats, changed to being controlled by the Republicans. And so a lot of URLs went away and stopped working during that change. And if we have another change of control for the Senate with the next elections, the same thing will happen all over again. So a lot of content will suddenly disappear, and when it comes back up, who knows if it'll come back the same way. I should note, before I go on to the end here, that some of the committees view the record of a hearing a little more as fact. And so the judiciary hearings, no matter whether you come from the minority page or from the majority page, will show you the exact same content. So the two parties are not in disagreement on what the basic facts are on a hearing. However, the House Energy and Commerce, for an example, does not necessarily agree on what that content is. And if you want to go into like the Wayback Machine, you can see how some of these pages have changed over time. These are some of the references that I use to present some of the facts, and where I got some of the images.
Jen had a question about the difference between, if you could talk a little bit more about how investigative hearings are different from.
So how an investigative hearing would be different, say, a legislative hearing?
Uh-oh.
So an investigative hearing is usually associated with something catastrophic that happened. So there may not be any legislation associated with it at all. So on that early slide where I was showing you the legislative process, committees don't have to have a particular bill assigned to them in order to hold a hearing. So the PB oil spill, there were committees that were holding hearings trying to determine what this was going to affect, have an effect on, say, the environment, an effect on farming, the quality of our food. The committees can just have a hearing. If they have funds to do it, they can investigate whatever they want. Whereas when it comes to the legislative process, let me go back to that slide really quick. So in the legislative process, you have a bill that's been introduced and a hearing that is assigned to look at that bill. And that committee can choose to do nothing, or it can choose to do several things, one of which is to hold a hearing. So in this committee work, in a legislative hearing, legislative history, it is looking at a bill that's been proposed or something that's being considered, whereas an investigative hearing can just happen. It doesn't have to fall any place in this process. Are there any other questions? Oh, how long does it take for the committees to post their videos and transcripts on their site? Most of the committees seem to be putting up their videos, the archives of it, quickly. So I think the last time I looked for the hearing on the Agricultural Department, they only streamed and did not provide a video, but I could be wrong about that. They may have changed that. I should have looked before I did the webinar today. In terms of the transcripts, some of the transcripts will be available on the committee websites. They'll link to them, and others just never will. And they might choose to link to GPO's FDSys site, or they might have a copy of it that is within their own URL domain address. But it really just depends on the committee and how they want to go about things. If it's on C-SPAN, then you'll be able to get it from C-SPAN as soon as they put it up. Oh, good question. So is GPO provided transcripts edited by committees before being posted? I have to admit I'm not familiar with what the rules actually say about corrections to transcripts. There would be a stenographer in the room. They would have the video recording to check on things as well. I assume that they could proofread and look for, incorrect transcriptions. But unless they order GPO to print it, we don't have access to it. Is there any representation indication pre or post-fact as to the veracity of expert testimony? That is to say, does anyone ever call out someone who maybe has misrepresented his or her industry? I'm not sure, but I guess I would say that you could look in public media, in newspaper articles, magazine articles, blogs, and see if people are questioned as to whether or not they had honest testimony. One of the things to note is that the House committee now, the committees now have to, or they tend to post their truth and testimony statements. So the person that's asked to testify is basically swearing to tell the truth. Now, whether or not they do, that's a different story. Are there other questions?
I just want to thank you, Carmen. This was fantastic. I had never had such a clear explanation of hearings, so this is really great. And we will we recorded this when we will be putting this up on our website. I'll send that out to the list of everybody who signed up tomorrow, and you can get the slides and the recording if you like. There was one more question actually that came in. Do you find that particular resources are better for finding different kinds of hearings, using one site for identifying legislative versus another site for investigative?
Yeah, I used to try to play with ProQuest Congressional to see if I could specifically look for, say, an investigative hearing, and I couldn't really do it. I don't know of anybody that is doing metadata that specifically describes them based on those 4 types. But, anytime you have an appropriation hearing, it's legislative. If it's an event that has recently happened, there's a good chance it's going to be a mix of oversight and investigative at the same time. And it could easily become a legislative hearing. The nominations, the confirmation and nomination are going to be keywords, so you can find those probably more easily than a specific hearing that's really only legislative or really only investigative.
And don't forget, one of the points of these webinars is to connect you with the people. So feel free to email her if you have any questions.